Greetings and salutations, loyal viewer out there on the internet.com. We have an absolutely amazing and lovely video. Just look at my hand gestures describing this video. Now, the thing that we're going to talk about today is absolutely wonderful. Lauren Southern and a guy named Connor, who I believe has a channel called Counterpoints, I will link it in the description because he did a wonderful job, debated Lance from the Serfs, or is it the Surf? We do this joke every time and it's not ever funny. And some other guy named like Two-Tailed Beast or whatever, Bijudama, who cares? And this debate, regardless of the participants, because all it needed was Lance being Lance and Lauren Southern being Lauren Southern, was absolute gold. Uh-oh, I said gold. You guys know what that means. What if I told you could get your hands on some gold from one of the most iconic shipwrecks in United States history? These pieces would serve as your piece of one of the most iconic periods in United States history. And of course, I'm talking about the California Gold Rush. And in fact, this shipwreck itself was a major contributor to the Panic of 1857. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the Titanic. If you thought that, then you need to look up when the Titanic actually sank. I'm talking about the USS Central America. This ship, known as the Ship of Gold, that sunk all the way back in 1857, over 160 years ago, has recently had the gold exhumed. And after a lengthy legal battle over who actually owns the gold, the coins are now up for sale and you can get your own along with a certificate of authenticity that proves that these coins come from the USS Central America. Now, we often talk about gold as an investment on this channel, but these coins aren't just an investment, they're a piece of history. So what are you waiting for? Call 877-646-5347 to get your hands on these gold coins right now. Again, that's 877-646-5347. These coins will go faster than Lance's spine. So the premise of this debate has to do with this thing that Lance has been obsessing over ever since the initial news reports. And the topic, by the way, is actually quite serious. According to some experts who did some ground penetrating radar outside of what are called residential schools in Canada, they found what looked like to be a lot of graves underneath the soil at these schools. Now, ever since this discovery, Lance has been elated. He's been celebrating this across Twitter because now you have an instance of something new in the press, even though it's from a long time ago, that says white people bad, look what they did to those natives, and Lance couldn't be more excited about it. However, this was already pretty well known in the government of Canada. They had like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2008. Don't quote me on the year because I didn't care enough to look it up, where they acknowledged that these residential schools, specifically in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, were really bad for Native Americans. And I don't mean bad as in like mildly bad. I mean, these people had their children taken from them to these schools. They were mistreated. They were abused. Some of them died. Some of those deaths were not only due to neglect or due to disease or due to them running away or due to accidental fires, but purposeful killings or the consequences of purposeful beating. And it's an absolutely horrible part of Canada's history that Lance wants to celebrate and throw in everybody's face because he loves Canada. But there's a couple of problems with that, and they're the same problems that Lance always runs into whenever he breaks down any story. And that's that he has not a lot of factual basis for the stuff that he's claiming. First and foremost, ground penetrating radar, the technology used to discover what these grave sites were, can't really determine who's in the graves. It can't really determine whether or not these were mass graves or individual graves, and it actually isn't capable of detecting bodies. What it actually detects is anomalies underneath the soil. So it's not until the point where these bodies get exhumed that we'll know what actually happened here, whether or not there are bodies, whose bodies are there, etc., etc. Now, the bodies are near Native schools. We know some kids died during Native schools. We understand, or at least we should understand, that children a long time ago, not just in the United States, but in Canada as well, were way more likely to die from diseases that are preventable today through treatments or through vaccines. And if they lived at those schools, they would likely be buried near those schools. So the presence of potential graves actually tells us nothing about how those kids died, or even if those kids are related to the schools. This could just be an overgrown cemetery, which was a point made by Lauren Southern and made by Connor throughout the course of the debate. But Lance is one of the worst faith people that you can ever possibly talk to. He can never acknowledge that he's wrong, and he can never tell the truth. So Lance and this other guy's responses to Lauren Southern and Connor's rebuttals to their points were absolutely ridiculous, and thus they are the subject of this video. But before we get into the first clip of that, I just want to play this clip because I have no other time to play this, of Lance saying that I'm endorsing Jimmy Dore when I'm specifically not endorsing Jimmy Dore.
And Jimmy Dore, like, even though I'm enjoying this, like, I'm not a Jimmy Dore fan, and I can't stand people in my audience, so hi guys, that say Jimmy Dore's the correct leftist, Jimmy Dore's the good leftist. Like, let me be 100% clear about something. Have you ever heard this idea that the Young Turks inspired a police shooting?
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, so it's the Baton Rouge one. I won't name the name for the algorithm.
So that's another endorsement. We've had a few endorsements for Jimmy Dore over the days, but there's another one. AJW, Tim Pool, both giving Jimmy Dore the thumbs up, the sign of approval, which is great. Just great to see. You love to see it, you know?
Now, if that's how Lance responds to me saying the exact opposite thing in a topic that doesn't matter, whether or not I would personally endorse Jimmy Dore, which I wouldn't, by the way, that was clear and obvious if he was actually listening, think about what he would do on a topic that he's actually passionate about, a topic that he purports to care harder than almost any other people on the internet, in Twitch land or whatever. Of course, he's going to react the same way. And then it's Lauren Southern, and Lauren Southern, evil Lauren Southern. So you know it's going to be great. So listen to how these guys respond to what Lauren Southern says about ground penetrating radar. That's 100% accurate, quoted from the sources that the initial reporting was taken from.
You're saying I'm lying by saying no mass graves have been found. So tell me, where have the mass graves been found?
Well, the story that kicked it off was the Kempelus residential school mass graves that were identified using ground penetrating radar.
Right, and ground penetrating radar cannot detect bodies.
Are you saying that as an assertion?
Absolutely, you can go look this up. In fact, the woman who conducted the GPR herself actually went to my university. She said herself, we cannot confirm anything. This is simply an assumption based on, and I would encourage people watching to go and take a look at what images ground penetrating radar show. They just show anomalies in the ground. They don't give you any context. They don't tell you if bodies are there. The anomalies could appear to be graves. Do they know if this grave site is just an overgrown graveyard? Do they know if it was the community graveyard? Do they know if there are any bodies in what these ground anomalies look like? No. And this is the facts of the case. The woman who did the ground penetration test in Kamloops, which sparked this all off, stated, we cannot know if there are any bodies under here until someone has dug this up and they've exhumed the bodies, if they are there. And not only that, but the tribe leader there in Canada of the Kamloops band that brought out the initial statement about this said, even if there are bodies under the ground here, it's not a mass grave. And these are just preliminary findings, which has been the general consensus of all of these grave sites found.
Okay, so I have to stop it here so that you guys can understand what Lauren Southern actually said, because the responses to what Lauren Southern said are going to be completely different to what actually was said in reality. So Lauren Southern said that the woman who did the ground penetrating radar, she's quoted in the article that everybody is using, says that it's actually indeterminative what these things actually are, whether they're bodies or not, whether they're mass graves or individual graves. And they actually have to exhume those graves in order to make that determination, because ground penetrating radar doesn't do exactly what is being reported or implied in the media later as precisely as they're saying. So it can't detect bodies, it detects shapes or anomalies. They're assumed to be bodies for other reasons, but only when you exhume them can you actually tell any factual or detailed information. And Lauren Southern also said that this person was an instructor at the university, or is an instructor at the university that she previously attended. The reason you guys need to understand that is because the anonymous guy, the one who won't show his face, the Tails guy who basically falls asleep halfway through the conversation, then pops up and demands they retract 20 minutes later, is going to pretend like Lauren Southern is quoting her friend, and then he's going to question whether or not she's quoting her friend because Lauren Southern doesn't pronounce her alleged friend's name right.
So who did you go to school with?
No, she's an instructor at the university I went to, and I mean, I can read her name
this
here.
isn't actually someone
So
who's related
this
to the
is
company.
the girl who did the GPR technology test, which once again, GPR cannot pick up organic matter. Her name was Sarah Bellew. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm terrible with French names. So she conducted
were
the search
friends with her reason you
herself,
don't know her name.
and she stated, nothing she has found can be confirmed unless excavations are done at the scene. These excavations have not happened.
Well, at this point, I'm a little bit lost. She's friends with someone whose name she doesn't know how to pronounce, who isn't the director of the company who was hired to do the scanning. So at this point, I don't understand exactly what it is we're discussing. I thought we were here to discuss burning of churches and restorative justice. If you'd like to challenge GPR and whether or not it's efficacious in the use of archaeological remains, I would point you to Etzanoa. Are you also challenging the identification of literally every site in the Americas that has...
Can I jump ahead?
Wait, I would tell two rabbits finish what they were trying to say. Could you finish that?
Because this is outside the scope of this conversation. I keep hearing affirmations of, oh, well, I know a person. I don't care that you know a person. I am
That's not
talking
my
about the
statement.
company that did the work.
I'm talking
Okay.
about the woman who every Canadian article has stated did the search in Kamloops. And anyone can look this up. Go look up who did the GPR test in Kamloops. I'm reading the Globe and Mail right now. The title, Anthropologist Explains How She Concluded 200 Children Were Buried at Kamloops Residential School.
Okay,
And-
stop right there.
Yep.
Stop right there. How she concluded the 215
Yep.
bodies were buried.
And with,
So
once again, that's
she
just
said-
media bullshit, because the article literally says she also stressed her findings cannot be confirmed unless excavations are done at the scene.
Now, you could tell by the tone of voice of this individual that he is not looking to have a reasonable conversation or discussion. He's not really trying to listen to what Lauren Southern is saying, and this is obvious because if he was listening, he wouldn't be talking about Lauren Southern's friend because she never said anything about her friend. He would be talking about what she actually said. He's trying to get a one-up, he's trying to get a win, he's trying to get a clip. So he's saying, you're quoting your friend instead of empirical evidence, when she's quoting the person cited in the article who did the ground penetrating radar.
When we're talking about things like ground penetrating radar, I again go back. If we're going to challenge the findings of those who have done the research, then you're challenging the foundation of archaeology in the Americas. If you would like to do that and lay out your argument for a better technique for identifying locations that should be excavated, I welcome you to do so. You haven't proposed anything remotely resembling that. What you did instead was to say that you went to school with a person whose name you can't pronounce, who is somehow vaguely related to a company who's oddly not listed anywhere on the company's prospectus. That's not terms, that's not definitions, and that's certainly not facts. That's just random anecdotes.
Again, the smug, ridiculous tone of voice, like you're getting this big one-up moment, you're gonna clip this out and throw it out to all your Spurgs and they're gonna cheer for you, when he's completely wrong on what was actually stated in the conversation that he's being smug about. It's in fact, the thing that he's wrong about is the basis for the smugness that he's delivering. Absolutely absurd, but it really goes to show the true colors of this individual. By the way, if you're the anonymous person on a stream, if you're the one hiding your face, you're the one not revealing yourself, and everybody else is showing their face, then you can't be that smug. You have to at least come up to the level of everybody else out there before you start copying an attitude. That's just my thing. I know that some people are more anonymous or whatever, but, you know, maybe this person has their name out there, but that's just my opinion. That's my feeling. Happens to be 100% correct. Let's get into even more ridiculousness.
We cannot talk about this as if it's something that happened a long time ago and just a sordid part of our past. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Okay, if you want some context, last time Canada won the Stanley Cup was 1993. Fucking Nirvana was still playing. You know, like that's not generations ago.
Cool. Yeah. So this is something that really rubs me the wrong way. Whenever people talk about residential school programs and compare the residential schools that were opened in the 1800s to the ones that existed in the 90s and were closed down then. If we talk about, for example, Lance talked about an electric chair existing and then said the last residential school that existed was shut down in 97. That school was called Cavalic Hall, and it was closed
96.
in 96. It was closed in the Northwest Territories. It was not set up as a residential school. In fact, it was a whole legal battle with the Canadian government to even get it registered as a residential school, because what it actually was it was a hostel/boarding room that was set up for kids who did not have families that were near high schools because they were too rural. So the Northwest Territories government said, okay, we need to create boarding in the town, and then if kids are way far out in the middle of nowhere, we can give them the option to go to high school so they have somewhere to stay.
So what I absolutely love about this point is that it's completely devastating to the nonsense that Lance has been putting out onto the internet, because we all know, or we all have a sense that bad things happen in the past, and the further back into the past you go, the worse those things get. I mean, remember, the modern eugenics movement was a part of the progressive movement in the United States of America in the 20s. So we understand that likely the 60s would have been a better period of time for minorities than the 20s. Not perfect, but we understand that. We understand that now, or recent times, would have been better for minorities than the 60s or the 20s. We all get this. We all understand linear time, but Lance doesn't, and Lance knows that if he wants to portray this as an ongoing crisis or an ongoing genocide, he has to extend the length of these events more into the future in order to emphasize how major it was, how big of a deal it was, not just in the past, but in the present. Because Lance is trying to make the argument that right now, this very second, the Canadian government is actively genociding the native populations today. Not back then, not what would be qualified as a cultural genocide back then, but a legit genocide today. So Lauren bringing up the fact that the residential school, or what they're calling a residential school that closed in the 90s, has absolutely nothing to do with the horrors that we're talking about in the past, is an excellent bullet right to the heart of Lance's argument. And Lance's response is so amazing, so absurd, so ridiculous, it cracks me up.
Yeah, I guess my first response would be that if your assertion is that nothing bad happened at that school and then therefore it doesn't matter, my statement as to which the last residential school closed in 1996, I think you're just resorting to pedantry. That doesn't change the fact that it was still considered a residential school. And I would also like you to provide evidence that nothing bad ever happened in that institution. And I would also like you to provide evidence that nothing bad ever happened in that institution.
And I would also like you to provide evidence that nothing bad ever happened in that institution.
Again, a normal person in this scenario, if they didn't know that, they'd say, I didn't know that. Or they would admit if they were perpetuating misinformation, they were wrong, or they would at least try to change the subject, which Lance tries to do later, but they wouldn't double down in such an absurd way. So Lauren Southern makes the case that's obvious that this particular school from the 90s was founded in a rural area where people didn't have their own high schools. It was a live-in school, and thus it was called a residential school, but nobody was forced to attend this school. It was voluntary, and obviously if you want a high school education and there's no high schools around in your own communities, it makes sense to go to this school. But it shouldn't be qualified as the same thing when we're talking about back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, where Native children were taken from their parents by force and put into these terrible conditions.
So if that's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life, you've lived a more privileged life than I thought possible. And I'm just going to say this, the burden of proof would then be upon you. If you're going to assert that this school doesn't really constitute a residential school because at the end of the day, nothing bad happened here related to the same systems in place from the other residential schools in Canada, then again, please demonstrate that with some kind of factual evidence.
That should be obvious to everybody. Basically, the argument that Lance is making is that the electric chair is really immoral because people survive it. They were put through it multiple different times. It's unbelievably painful, and thus it is cruel and unusual punishment. But it's an ongoing crisis to this day because some police departments tase suspects sometimes, and that's electricity, which is kind of like the electric chair. Therefore, the last electric chair, it was really recently. This is basically the premise that Lance is operating on. And the electric chair, unlike the residential schools, is actually more recent in our history, or at least the legitimate ones, because as also brought up in the debate, the residential schools, a lot of them in the 70s, 60s, and 80s, were handed over to Native hands and run by over decades by some of these Native American groups for their own children. So saying this policy extended all the way throughout when the abuses are mostly concentrated in a very specific period of time, and yes, they were horrible abuses, and they were completely different, and sometimes they shared something in name only in the future, is absolutely ridiculous. It's a denial of linear time, and it's just a way for Lance to kind of extend this out because he lives for this, because he gets to be the virtuous activist that's against kidnapping and beating children to death, as if there's people on the other side of that issue, as if that's a confusing moral quandary in the United States of America or in Canada.
And can you establish then that nothing bad happened in that school? And if you can, fine.
But the sheer stupidity, the sheer audacity of Lance to tell Lauren Southern that in order to say that the residential school that she's describing, that Lance brought up as the last residential school that closed in 1996 or 97, is different from the ones in the 1800s, that Lauren Southern must go and prove that, quote, nothing bad ever happened at that school for that to be proven as different is patently absurd. Lance, you're a buffoon. You are trying to get somebody to prove a negative, and you think that this is a good debating tactic. Wouldn't it just be better to say that this happened, it was horrible throughout Canadian history, and the Canadian government never really made amends for it in your mind? Even if the 1996 school, you could let that go, but you can't let it go because you're the most disingenuous person on the internet. He gets called Spineless Lance, which is a nickname given to him by Destiny, and he lives up to that by the fact that he keeps trying to snake around every legitimate criticism of the non-points that he's making. Also, another thing that I noticed that Lance was doing that was actually a little bit more clever than anything Lance has ever done before is that when he got backed down, when he got cornered, when his facts were total nonsense, rather than acknowledging that, because Lance comes from this debate school where you can't have a reasonable conversation because you're not a person that could ever accept being wrong because you have a huge ego and you're so afraid of embarrassment that you can't operate and function like a normal person, Lance would deflect. But the way that he would deflect was pretty clever for Lance, at least. He would deflect to sexual abuse of the native kids at the residential schools. He did it multiple different times throughout the course of the debate, and if you didn't realize, likely because you're in Lance's audience and thus you are dumber than Lance, because the only way a creator like Lance can function is if he finds people that are dumber than him, that Lauren said nothing related to what Lance responded with, you would think, or at least have the impression, that Lauren was somehow ambiguous on her stance on the abuse of children, which is absolutely ridiculous. So while it is important to highlight and laugh at Lance when he's saying things that just don't make any sense because he doesn't know anything about the topics that he's talking about, it's also important to show Lance to be the snake that he is with the instances that I highlighted. Now, there's a few other moments in this debate that we gotta go over because they're hilarious, and the one that I'm thinking of off the top of my head is the idea that the increase in church fires, and by the way, for those of you who are unaware, the Catholic Church ran a lot of these schools, or they were ran with the Catholic Church and the government teaming up. So there's been a lot of fires at Catholic Church post the revelations of these potential mass graves, that these fires are likely being caused due to the fact that one priest or two priests at one church have set their church on fire because they were sloppy with their incense candles.
Oh, I can answer that question quite easily. The information, I find it interesting that we've just glossed past the fact that these church burnings have actually been happening since long before the news was released. But in scouring through the information over the last, probably 2 years, trying to find church burnings, causes, whether or not there were investigations performed, I found one that was particularly funny to me, which was, it was a church that has burned in the same spot 3 separate times over the last 50 years. And it turned out that it was the area where the priests keep the incense and the anointing oil, because for some reason, I don't know why, this particular group of priests is just not aware that you probably shouldn't have an open flame next to flammable oil. And so this is the 5th time that the fire department has been called out. So I would have liked to see you discuss, for example, why it is that Canadian churches seem to be exempt from fire codes, or be aware that fire extinguishers have been invented.
So the basic premise of this Tails guy, whatever his name is trying to make is twofold. One, there are fires at churches that happen sometimes, and some of those times were before these revelations angered a lot of people, and that was the dramatic increase of fires at churches. And one of those instances of a fire that happened around this time or before this, whatever, was the 3rd instance in which this particular church had an accident with their candles. So why don't priests follow fire codes?
I would have liked to see you discuss, for example, why it is that Canadian churches seem to be exempt from fire codes, or be aware that fire extinguishers have been invented.
The reason I emphasize the why don't priests follow fire codes thing is because that absurdity just goes to show you that this person has weird animosity towards the Catholic Church that they need to work out on their own, because that's not even a fitting component of their argument. But yes, churches have burned previously. Like, for instance, churches would have burned before September of 2001, or mosques specifically probably burned before 2001 of September in the United States of America. But if we saw an uptick in burnings specifically at mosques after September of 2001, we would likely attribute that to potentially something. Like, something maybe would have angered people, and those angry people may have taken that out on a religious group. Like, you understand that when a trend spikes up after a major event or after a major news item, that it's not unreasonable to attribute at least a portion of that trend to the coverage in the news and the anger and emotion that is associated with that coverage in the news. That was the point that Lauren and Connor were trying to make, but this guy was adamant that the candles in this one church that had multiple different burnings was likely the cause of not only the fires, but the vandalism that accompanies the fires, that basically states out what the reason behind setting this place on fire was.
I have a question. Are Catholic priests also putting paint on the front of their churches and beheading their statues, paint that says fight for, X progressive cause? I've literally seen the Serfs tweeting out stuff that says, we were just Indigenous children. Are the Catholic priests putting that up on their church walls? Are they the ones doing that graffiti? That's been an exponential growth the last few months.
I'm more than willing to acknowledge that there's plenty of things that have been happening over the last 3 or 5 or 10 years that could be charted in any number of conceivable ways. But you haven't actually addressed what I said, which was
say it again.
These fires preceded the news.
Okay. Here, let me break this down for you really quickly. I was a former law enforcement officer, okay? We investigate things. When something picks up in a certain pattern, let's say that there's like one burglary in one area, and then it's just one burglary and then it happens. Okay, well, burglary happens, we try to investigate it. If we don't figure it out, then okay, whatever. If 20 burglaries occur in the same area within a month, there's probably a reason for it, so you can investigate it. And what I'm doing right now is I'm doing 1 + 1 = 2.
Now, finally, what we have to talk about is closing statements. And by the way, you have to know that a lot of these lefties are trying to generate 90-second to 2-minute clips for their channel, for Twitter, so that they can hype themselves up. And Lance is one of the absolute worst at this. He actually writes out his little closing spiel before the debate because he's not smart enough to think of what he wants to say during the course of the debate. And this is what he did to Lauren Southern.
Yeah, I don't think there can be any restorative justice as long as the people responsible aren't taking claims for the actions they've done. If I could use a simile, it's kind of like you, Lauren Southern, because ultimately, if you had spent your career rising to become one of the darling children of the alt-right, palling around with people like Brittany Pettibone, Richard Spencer, touring around the globe with someone like, let's say, Stefan Molyneux, who is well known for measuring the skulls of black and white people, spreading the Great Replacement conspiracy, spreading the Great Genocide conspiracy theory, then going on tour spreading both of those conspiracy theories, in addition to going to join that far-right nationalist group, First Europa, and then joining them by shooting flares at immigrants, and doing all of this while at the same time all of it bubbles over and boils over to the point where at the end of the day you ultimately led to one of the people contributing towards the Christchurch shooting, who declared that the Great Replacement theory was one of the reasons why they committed the atrocity that they did. Afterwards,
You
then
fucking
took everything
pussy.
back.
You fucking pussy.
Afterwards,
Bringing this
you took
all up
everything
at the
back.
end so I don't have a chance to respond. Fuck you.
You can
wait,
respond.
You little bitch.
I'm
You're
more than
lying.
glad.
Now, Lauren broke one of my major rules, which is always make people like Lance go first in their closing statement, because that way they have to stick around for your response. However, her calling him out during his closing statement was absolutely hilarious because it was so accurate to the fact that Lance is such a spineless coward.
Walk away from it.
You're such a bitch, Lance.
Okay.
Bring it
Well,
up. Let's go. Let's go. Talk to me. I'm staying right here. I'm not
throw
going anywhere.
7,000 accusations at me and then ask me to respond to them. That's great. Connor and I are going to have a chat with my chat. And if you want to not be a bitch boy and have a full conversation another time, we can do that. And we'll arrange that.
Lauren is 100% right here because Lance is being a total coward, saving this up for the last 2 minutes. Throughout the course of the debate, even though Lance is being pissy, a little bitchy towards Lauren and towards Connor, he's at least having the conversation. He's at least presenting the veneer that he can have a respectful discussion with people on the other side. But he wrote out this stuff prior to the conversation. That's what Lance does. He prepares this with his little dorks in Discord. He probably rehearses it in the mirror so that he can get his words out correctly. And he knew the whole time he was going to try to sandbag her like this. So having Lauren look dead into the camera and call him out as he's doing it was absolutely hilarious. It goes to show you what a weasel Lance is, that he would save this up and then try to bait her into coming onto his stream afterwards so he can get more viewers on her. That's the thing that these people like to do. They're going to attack you. They're going to smear you. They're going to show no human decency or respect in conversating with you, but then they demand your time so that they can get ratings out of the situation because it's all a show. Also, Lance, of course, is going to try to clip this out, put it on Twitter and be like, I own the guy. I own Lauren. I got her. Even though he didn't. He's a weasel. He's a coward. This proves that he is a coward. And Lauren identifying this mid over-rehearsed speech was absolutely hilarious, and it's indicative of Lance's character. And as I say multiple different times, with some people, it's a fact-based issue. With some people, it's an intellectual disparity. But with other people, it's also combined with a character disparity. And that's what Lance is, tenfold, almost greater than any other person I've interacted with on the internet. Absolute weakness all around, Lance. Congratulations, you embarrassed yourself. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked the video, you can show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. Follow me, social media, support me. There's more links in the description bottom. Till next time.